This might be a long one, but this is a creepy thing that happened to me about 4 years ago. For starters, I grew up in southwest Saskatchewan and moved onto my aunt's farm in 2019 to live in the other house that is on their property. The house is fairly old, but I loved it. It wasn't long after I moved in, though, that I started to feel uneasy in the house alone. I would close every window when it got dark, as it felt like something was watching me through them every night. Eventually, I decided to get a puppy to keep myself company when my boyfriend at the time was at work or away from the house. It helped to have the company, but I always dreaded having to take her outside when it was dark. For a bit of scene setting, our house sat on the left side of the gravel road. At the back of the house, there was about 10 meters of backyard, and then there was the cow pasture and the cow barn. We didn't own cows, but in the summer another farmer would rent our pasture space, and so we would have them on the property. It wasn't uncommon at night to hear coyotes surround the farm either, and there were tons. Every so often when I'd go out with my puppy, we'd hear them all around us, too close for comfort. We had a farm dog too, who would keep the coyotes away for the most part, as she was huge, but every so often she'd wander elsewhere on the property to scout, and the coyotes would get a little too close for comfort. They always tried to lure my puppy out to them, but luckily I kept her leashed. Now, one thing you should know about my pup is that it takes her forever to find a spot to go potty. This is still a problem today, 4 years later, but back then, it was the bane of my existence. She would pace for at least 5 minutes, and that was only after finding a suitable spot. Sometimes we would be out there for damn near a half hour, just so she would go, and not go in the house. Another problem of hers. Huskies, am I right? On this particular night, it was raining pretty heavily. I was not happy to be out there, and she had decided that she wasn't gonna go until she found her perfect spot. We had already been out for 15 minutes, and at this point, she was also getting frustrated with the rain and wanted to go inside, but I wanted her to go before we went in, since we'd already been out there for so long. So, as any annoyed puppy mother would do, I started getting a little frustrated and would repeat, "Go, go, potty," every time she'd get distracted from her objective. It was dark, I was cold and annoyed, and to make matters worse, the cows behind us were fussing fairly loudly. This was out of the ordinary for them. They were usually quiet and sleeping at this time of night. I was also hearing what sounded like a strange bird whistling, but shook it off as probably being an owl. I tried to keep it off my mind as I kept shouting and pleading "go" through the rain to my small, fuzzy white asshole. I was facing away from the pasture, and suddenly in my left ear I heard it. Go. Now, one thing you should know about me is, I have a very strong flight response typically, but this froze me on the spot, as I was mostly confused at WTF I'd just heard. I tried telling myself I didn't hear it. I tried telling myself that it was just a moo from a cow that I heard wrong. But again, as if spoken directly behind me, I heard it again. Go. Go. It sounded unnatural. It was as if it came from someone who had never spoken a word before. A raspy, deep, monotone go. It almost sounded like it was coming out of an old radio. But of course, there were no radios out there. Every time it said it, it sounded the exact same as the first time it was said, and whatever it was had started repeating it, as if it had been taught its new favorite word. At this point, I spun around to the pasture to find nothing there. Then, again from behind me, go. This had all happened in the span of about 3 seconds, and at this point I remember shouting out loud, "All right, don't have to tell me twice," as I picked up my little fur ball and made a mad dash for my front door. I swiftly locked both doors behind me and sat bewildered in my kitchen. Puppy went back to puppying immediately, obviously unbothered by it all, and Happy Mum wasn't making her stay out in the rain any longer. I picked up my phone and called my aunt, asking her if my uncle had been out in the field with the cows. She said no, and I explained to her what had just happened to me. She sent my uncle over to the pasture to check it out, but soon after told me he hadn't seen or heard anything. He said he'd check the pasture again in the morning. I spent my night hiding from the windows, with the lights and TV on loud enough to not hear anything outside. The next morning when my uncle checked on the pasture, he found 2 calves dead. Explains the colossal cow panic that had ensued the night before. I regret this, but I didn't push for more information as I honestly just didn't want to know. But they told me, other than that, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. A few months later, I moved off the farm. I couldn't be in that house alone anymore, and my boyfriend and I had parted ways. A few months after that, I started going to therapy for the paranoia this had caused me. I started feeling like people were watching me, out to get me. Another few months after that, I moved out of the province for good and finally felt safe. I'm wondering if any of you here have any idea what the hell this would have been. There's no chance there would have been someone in our field, as we were fairly far away from town and neighbors, and we have cameras that would have seen anyone enter our property. Coyotes are common, but I don't think they are capable of mimicking words, lol. Any ideas? Back in 2021, my family took a trip to Lake Sanitla in North Carolina. A beautiful lake that's rich in Native American history and surrounded by mountain trails. We decided to go on one of these trails on an overcast day. I am not an athletic person and suffer from asthma, so I was behind the rest of my family by myself. About almost halfway through the hike, I heard my sister yell my birth name, but it sounded like it was off the trail. She never calls me by real name, just my nickname I've had since I was a baby. It sounded like she was scared, so I was very tempted to run off and find her. But I knew my sister wasn't stupid. She wouldn't go off the trail, even in case of an emergency. I quickly caught up to the rest of my family, and my sister was there with them, resting on some rocks next to a waterfall, chatting away and taking pictures. I asked my sister if she had called my name. She didn't know what I was talking about. She had been talking to our dad the whole time. I don't know what called my name that day, but I'm glad I didn't listen to it. Who knows what would have happened to me? I haven't been to that trail since this encounter. I don't have a clue what called my name. If you're educated on Appalachian folklore, please give me some insight on what happened to me. I grew up in Vietnam. My family is very affluent, so we had just 10 acres of land all to ourselves. No one else really lived here except a house here and there. Our closest neighbors were 3 miles away. Our territory wasn't gated except for a smallish brick wall, and we had a ton of street dogs that we adopted that kind of roamed around. I was under strict instructions to never go anywhere past these certain trees that were marked. And once their sunset started, I couldn't go past the West Territory. Now I want to say that in Vietnam, people are very superstitious. It is not so much whether you believe in ghosts, spirits, the paranormal or not, but whether they can harm you. Whenever I walked past these trees, the dogs would furiously bark and a few would drag me back by my shirt, or even go bark at my family's workers and kind of tell on me. I always assumed that it was because I was very young, so they didn't want me to wander off and get lost. When I was 13, I became more and more interested. My family went to a funeral while the workers still worked, and my grandmother watched me. My grandmother was a very old woman. I was a very sneaky child. I obviously snuck off, and while I was wandering through the woods, I explores, saw pythons, lizards, water monitors, and monkeys. Here's the weird thing. I felt like the whole time these animals were like kind of leading me to something, if that makes sense. I distinctly remember the first animal that I saw was a huge dragonfly. It led me past the marked trees on the east side of my territory, and then I saw a frog that had really weird texture to it, very rough, kind of lizard-like. I felt like I was in a trance-like state, an animal transformed into another animal, and I began to come to the realization that these weren't different animals, but the same one transforming. I didn't see it transform, but it could be a monitor lizard, and then it would go past a rock, and the next animal would be a huge python. I should also mention that all my dogs, we had about 20 of them at that time, were fiercely protective of me and trailed me like shadows. All the workers always said that wherever I walks, a horde of dogs would follow, and when I slept around night, they all slept directly outside my window. However, less and less dogs followed me as I got deeper into the woods. By the time I saw the lizard monitor, I'm pretty sure only a handful were still me. Most stayed back after the first few trees. I realized it was getting really dark, but the sky looked weird for some reason. I stopped following the animal, which was a monkey at this point, and just turned back. Getting back was a lot more difficult than getting there. When I was following the creature, I feel like the woods were just kind of opening up a trail for me. Like I didn't trip on any shrubs or vines, and nothing really blocked my way. The way going back, I was convinced the woods completely changed. I wasn't really scared, just a little cold, since I believed I didn't even wander off that far. Eventually I heard some dogs barking and followed, and I could see my house. Everyone was frantic when I came back. They had about 100 people searching for me, family and our workers, and a few more people like extended family of workers that owed favors to my family. Apparently I had been missing for 3 days, and the husband of one of my aunt's workers went in after me, and he's been missing since then. I got really scared and told my family what happened, and they white in the face. We drove to a very popular Buddhist temple, and we got blessed, and the monks told my family what they believed happened, while I stood outside, eavesdropping with my older cousin. Our family has a problem with people going missing. My grandmother's brother said he felt like he was being guided with a hand on his back, and he was stuck between 2 rocks. His old black dog found him, which is a common belief in Vietnam, that all black dogs are very powerful and can scare spirits away, which explains why my uncle always picked all black dogs. My grandma's first son was playing in a creek while she traveled a little more downstream to do laundry, and she said it seemed like someone pushed him in and held his head down, and as she tried to run to him, something in the water wrapped around her foot. A villager nearby ran down to save him. The monks gave me a Buddha necklace they blessed, and I still wear that necklace today. The man that went missing who was looking for me was never found, although my mom told me they did. I believe my aunt paid the wife a large sum of money and bought them a house far away and still sends money regularly. A few days after this, the workers started chopping down trees, and a fence was built around the east side of our territory, and we started a karaoke bar that now resides there. What do I believe happened? I have many theories, but I think the spirits are upset that my grandmother came into their land and built over it. Before my family cut down trees and built our house there, no one lived there. I think they were upset. We were disturbing their peace and quiet. I still don't like going hiking to this day. When I do, it's never a very far hike, and I don't let my dog off leash because I'm terrified. There's this place in Port St. Lucie, Florida, that's called the Devil's Tree. You can Google it, but essentially it's local lore that girls, nuns, there's different versions after it telephoned its way around, were raped and hung at this tree in a small forest, as well as satanic rituals being preformed at the base of this tree and in the woods as well. They tried to cut down the tree once word got out, but something always happened. They were rained out. Tools stopped working. Tree broke the tools. Insane coincidences every time they tried to take it down. I visited the tree myself twice, during the day of course. Once with a group of friends, and the other just myself and my other good friend. It's not labeled or anything, not a tourist attraction, but you know exactly which tree it is when you see it. You can see the attempts to cut and burn the tree down. All the while it looks bigger and healthier than the other trees around it. The first time I visited with my friends, everything was normal up until we got to the actual tree. Then, the stench of death hit us all at once. It made us all want to hurl, and apparently we weren't the only ones to smell it either. An entire nest of vultures were circling the area, about 30-50 of them in total. We searched the whole woods for the source of the smell, wanting to make sure there wasn't another murder or anything, and couldn't find it for the life of us. The second time I went, it was just me and my one close friend, and it was a much calmer, more observant trip. We were hanging out under the tree, reading when we both realized something. We were in complete silence. I mean, complete silence, which is incredibly unnerving for a small forest next to a public park in the middle of the day. There was no sound of bugs or squirrels or even wind. I took a video of it, unsure if I can find it again, but I'll definitely look and update this if I do. Just overall very ominous, definitely a dark energy in the forest. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, but I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy, and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night, so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces, laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet, and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before, and that an animal got in our stuff. I promised that I had locked it, and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it, and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. I was 8 years old when we first moved into the house on the edge of the forest. My parents had their doubts about buying a house with a backyard bordered by forest. They had concerns about wild animals getting into our bins or hurting our dogs, and were worried one of us might go too far into the trees and get lost. But it was cheap. My dad liked the seclusion, my mom loved the house itself, and my siblings and I were excited about playing in the backyard and exploring the forest. Our first sign that something wasn't right was that our dogs were absolutely terrified of the forest. They never went into the forest for any reason. If a toy they'd been playing with found its way past the tree line, they would refuse to retrieve it, and when one of us went in, they would pace anxiously until we returned. On occasion, we'd notice the dogs staring at a spot in the forest in obvious distress, sometimes growling or barking, but we could never see anything there. My brother once carried one of the dogs into the trees to show her there was nothing scary about it, but she wriggled out of his grip and sprinted into the house in a panic. If we were in the backyard when it was getting dark, we sometimes heard noises like someone was walking through the forest, sticks crunching underfoot, branches being pushed aside. If we called out, there was no response, but if we shined a flashlight around, we would occasionally catch a glimpse for just a split second of something that we could swear looked like a person walking around in the dark. My parents quickly banned us from entering the forest at all after dark, and even during the day we weren't allowed to go out of sight of the house. My sister's bedroom window looked out at the backyard and the forest beyond, and she remembers looking out her window one night and seeing a shadowy figure standing right at the edge of the backyard. She says there was something wrong with it, like it wasn't quite standing on the ground, and it was a little too tall to be a person, and it was sort of distorted, and she was convinced it was staring at her. She called for our dad, saying there was a man in the yard staring through her window, and when he ran outside to chase off whoever it was, she continued to watch the figure. It didn't move away, but when the light from our dad's flashlight passed over it, it suddenly just wasn't there anymore. We regularly heard knocking at the back door at night with no one there. Our parents thought it was teenagers playing pranks and stopped bothering even opening the door, until one rainy night when the knocking was persistent and agitated. My mom pointed out there might be someone needing shelter from the heavy rain outside, but when she opened the door, not only was there no one there, but there were no wet footprints on the porch. The knocking continued the whole time we lived there. It would happen several times in the span of a few weeks, then stop for months, then start up again. My parents eventually installed a security camera, and there was never anyone at the door. The camera wasn't all useless though. About 3 years into living there, my brother started having night terrors and sleepwalking. When he went sleepwalking, he would always go out the back door and start walking towards the forest. My mom, being a light sleeper, would hear the door open and would run out to get him before he made it into the forest. After the third or fourth time it happened, my brother asked to see the camera footage because he wanted to see how he looked when sleepwalking, I guess thinking it'd look funny. The footage showed him walking out onto the porch, then pausing as if listening to something and shaking his head, then reluctantly walking forward as if being pulled or forcefully guided by something. One evening my dad was in the backyard and he heard my sister calling him from the forest, seemingly in distress. Thinking she'd gone exploring in the forest and fallen over and hurt herself, he ran in and started calling to her, but quickly realized it was too dark to see her, and he couldn't pinpoint where her voice was coming from. He told her to wait where she was while he grabbed a flashlight. When he ran back into the house for the flashlight, he saw my sister inside, safe and completely unconcerned. At the time, my dad hadn't told us about hearing my sister's voice in the forest, so when I heard my mom's voice coming from the forest months later, while I was outside with the dogs one evening, I didn't question it despite the fact I'd seen my mom inside recently and hadn't noticed her walk past me. My mom was calling to me, saying she'd gotten her sweater caught in some branches and needed me to come in and help her. As I walked in, the dogs started barking, alerting my dad, who saw me through the window wandering into the forest. He came outside and called to me, and I said I was just helping Mom. He yelled back that Mom was inside, and I needed to run back to the house as fast as I could, which I did. After this, my parents had a fence built around the backyard and started looking for a new place. In the time between the fence being built and us moving out, it got way worse. We'd hear knocking at the door more regularly, as well as tapping on the windows, as if someone was walking the perimeter of the house and trying every window. We would often hear scratching and scraping sounds on the fence and voices beyond it. My brother's night terrors got more frequent, and one night, My mom didn't hear the door open when he went sleepwalking, and he woke up standing at the fence, staring into the forest, with the dogs barking at him. The last morning we spent there, less than 4 years after we moved in, we woke up to find the back door fully open, and the security camera footage showed it slowly swing open on its own. Since moving out, my brother's sleepwalking has stopped, though he still gets night terrors, and he suffers from pretty severe anxiety. A few nights ago, he called me out of the blue, and after a bit of small talk, he asked me if I think the door being opened that final night means whatever was out there finally got in. He was trying to make light of it, saying he was getting into the spirit of Halloween, joking about how maybe we should all get exercise just in case something latched onto us all those years ago. But I think he's deeply bothered by everything that happened. I know I still am a little. I still get nervous around dark wooded areas. I don't know what I think was out there in the forest behind our house at night. But I get the feeling that, given the chance, it would have swallowed us whole.